Now, on the 20th century, Ronald Reagan and the rise of the right. When Ronald Reagan first ran for political office, he was already deep into middle age, a former actor with conservative ideas. The 55-year-old Reagan won that race for governor of California, and then another term. And then he went on to serve 2 terms as president.
Government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
In the process, Reagan launched a conservative revolution that dramatically changed the face of American politics.
You ain't seen nothing yet.
I'm Mike Wallace, and this is the 20th century. The election of President Franklin Roosevelt in 1932 ushered in a half-century of liberalism that was marked by an unprecedented growth in the size of the federal government. All that came to an end with the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980.
It is time to get government off the backs of the people and turn this great people of ours loose out there, and we'll do what has to be done.
Americans had agreed with Ronald Reagan, but it wasn't until the 1990s, when a Democrat once again occupied the White House, that Americans found out how permanent the Reagan Revolution had become.
The era of big government is over.
That is a Reagan-esque statement that could have come straight from the mouth of the Gipper.
Author Peggy Noonan was a speechwriter for Ronald Reagan.
That is what he said starting in the early 60s, not in the early 90s. And that is what he believed. And now this liberal Democrat is forced to frankly embrace the obvious. Yes, things have changed.
To see how dramatically American political rhetoric had changed, return to 1964, that year of startling conservative triumph and ignominious Republican defeat. The words that won the hearts and minds of the right that year came from a dynamic, outspoken man of the West, Barry Goldwater.
He is the hottest thing on the lecture circuit. He pours out, with considerable help, books, articles, and columns. He flies his own airplane. He runs a department store. He is also senator from Arizona. Barry Goldwater, jet-propelled philosopher of conservatism.
I believe that the capitalistic profit free enterprise system is the best economic system ever developed. And when it operates with as much absence of government interference as possible, the economy operates the best.
When the Republican National Convention opened in San Francisco in July of 1964, most of the delegates were there for one reason: to nominate Barry Goldwater for president. But to many Americans, Goldwater's language there seemed tough, angry, even a bit frightening.
I would remind you that extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice.
Moderate Republicans, concerned about the national campaign ahead, prayed that Goldwater would try to broaden his base in his acceptance speech. But he did not. Instead, he threw caution to the winds, and some say he threw the election away with him.
And let me remind you also that moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue.
That speech spelled disaster for the Goldwater candidacy.
In 1964, liberalism was on its way up. John Kennedy had just died. LBJ was leading us in what he called the Great Society. And conservatism, certainly Barry Goldwater's conservatism, seemed somewhat angry, narrow, and cramped.
Tuesday, November 3rd, more than 70 million Americans went to the polls, and the results were no surprise.
According to a CBS vote profile analysis, Lyndon Baines Johnson has been elected President of the United States. His electoral vote has gone over the 270 figure by a single vote, 271. and the landslide has carried him in for his first term in office on his own right by his own election. Ladies and gentlemen, we take pride.
Despite the landslide, there had been one bright spot in the gloom of the conservative defeat: the nationally televised speech just a few days before the election by the motion picture star Ronald Reagan.
Humanitarian goals. They say we're always against things, we're never for anything. Well, the trouble with our liberal friends is not that they're ignorant. It's just that they know so much that isn't so. Now,
Reagan came on and said basically the same things in a different way, in a soft way. And people said, wow, that's what I thought we were.
Michael Deaver, a longtime Reagan advisor, served as deputy chief of staff during the early Reagan years.
Goldwater was saying it in a way that kind of left your teeth on edge.
I believe that the issues...
To Ronald Reagan's supporters, it has always been known as the speech. It was one he had delivered and polished at hundreds of banquets and business conventions as a spokesman for General Electric. But now he was addressing a national television audience. And if you had to pick a moment, this was the moment when Ronald Reagan became a national political figure.
You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. We'll preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth, or we'll sentence them to take the last step into 1,000 years of darkness.
Ronald Reagan profited almost across the board from his involvement in 1964 with Goldwater, because as a fairly well-known actor and citizen activist, he wasn't carried down by the strategic failure of the Goldwater campaign.
Among those watching Ronald Reagan that night was millionaire Henry Salvatore, president of a group called the Anti-Communist Voters League. He was a prominent Goldwater supporter.
This time, all of us agreed that this fellow was the candidate that could arouse the people of California.
So his speech launched him. It made him a hero to the conservatives, but it didn't alienate ordinary Republicans or Republican establishment politicians. And as a result, he was much stronger than people imagined when he ran for governor of California in 1966.
It is a responsibility handed to our party to represent not only our party, but millions of Democrats and independents in California who, like us, say, ya basta. We've had it.
Governor Pat Brown, who had previously defeated the best the GOP could throw at him for governor of California, including Richard Nixon, began what he thought would be the destruction of Ronald Reagan.
The old day when they get in that poll and they have to make a decision between a governor that's been acting and an actor, I think they're going to pull that down for Pat Brown. That's my opinion.
Pat Brown was only the first opponent to underestimate Ronald Reagan. They failed to see the skilled politician behind the actor's mask. He would not be the last.
Anybody who ever thought he was nothing but an actor was making a very bad mistake.
One of his greatest assets was the fact he was always underestimated. He was not only an actor, but in the eyes of the elite and the media, he was a right-wing actor. So it was a double whammy. I mean, you can't be an actor and a right-winger and have any brains, according to the elite.
Reagan beat Pat Brown by almost 1 million votes and went on to serve 2 terms as governor. He surprised liberals and conservatives alike by his pragmatic approach to government. He kept his campaign promise, turning the state's large deficit into a surplus. But to the chagrin of liberals, he also overhauled the family welfare system. And he outraged conservatives by signing the first bill in the nation permitting abortion for medical and emotional reasons.
I really think that he has taken us for granted. Disappointed is perhaps the best word to use. As far as I'm concerned, the words don't match up with the action.
I've tried to point out to Republicans that it's taken the opposition to 35 years to accomplish many of the things we're opposed to. We can't believe that someplace out of the sunrise, a man on a white horse is going to ride along, wave a wand, and if we get elected, change everything all at once.
Reagan was a great compromiser, which most people don't realize. And he was always willing at the end of the day to say, you know, I'll take a half a loaf and come back next year and try to get a little bit more.
Even though Ronald Reagan served 2 terms as governor of California, many Americans still refused to take him seriously. If, as an actor, he had seemed sometimes less than lustrous, As a politician, he seemed downright improbable. But after being elected twice as governor of the second most populous state in the Union, he was seen as a potential candidate for higher office.
He is the Republican perhaps most in demand outside his state as a crowd drawer and fundraiser. He tells Republican audiences what they want to hear, but he keeps saying that he is not a candidate.
I'm not a candidate. I am not a candidate, and I am not a candidate. I'm not a candidate.
The polite thing is to take a man at his word. But should circumstances develop in which the Republicans demanded that he be a candidate, nothing he has said would rule that out.
He became, by the end of the 60s, after Goldwater's defeat and after Nixon's election, clearly the leading conservative in American politics. And by 1980, that gave him a claim to conservative support that nobody could seriously contest.
In 1976, Ronald Reagan lost his bid for the Republican presidential nomination to the incumbent Gerald Ford. But in the wake of the Watergate scandal, perhaps no Republican could have won that year, and Gerald Ford narrowly lost to Jimmy Carter. Reagan, however, thought the Republican Party faced deeper problems.
My belief is the Republican Party is dead unless it stands up and erects a standard of principles around which people can rally and says, this is what we stand for.
Reagan would seek the Republican nomination once again in 1980, and this time his party and the country would be ready for him. That story when the 20th century returns. In 1980, the Republican National Convention nominated Ronald Reagan to run against President Jimmy Carter, and that was a prospect the Carter White House relished. Reagan, they felt, was too extreme for the country, an actor who would be no match for an incumbent president. So Carter and his advisors approached the election that year, confident that American voters would not cast their ballots for this man from Hollywood. How wrong they were.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Honorable Ronald Reagan.
Thank you. Ronald Reagan threw his hat into the ring with a flourish at the New York Hilton in November of 1979. His primetime announcement was televised across the nation.
I must say, this is a moment for quite some mixed emotions for me. I haven't been on primetime television for quite a while.
Had the Democrats been watching closely that night, they could have taken a look at some of the weapons in Ronald Reagan's rhetorical arsenal, deftly turning Jimmy Carter's gloomy observations about a national malaise to his own conservative advantage.
There's an unease all over this land with things the way they are. But the confidence we've lost is confidence in our government's policies.
First and foremost, he changed the dialogue. I mean, for 50 years we've been talking about how much money we were going to spend, and Reagan changed that to how much money we're going to cut.
We can restore incentives, invite greater economic growth, and at the same time help give us a better government instead of a bigger government.
But first, Ronald Reagan had to win the nomination of his party. After he lost the Iowa caucuses to former CIA Director George Bush, he moved on to campaign all out in New Hampshire. Reagan boldly seized the stage during a debate with his GOP rivals there.
Is this on? Would the sound man please turn Mr. Reagan's mic off for the moment?
I am paying for this microphone, Mr.
From that moment on, it seemed that Reagan was unstoppable. He won big in New Hampshire, and he kept on winning all across the country, 29 out of 35 primaries.
Thank you very much. See, fellas, if you want to know, that's why you run for office.
But throughout the campaign, Reagan was forced to fend off charges that he was a political lightweight.
The Carter strategy has an overall theme: belittle Ronald Reagan by claiming he is not up to the job.
I'm sure he's an extremely nice man. His friends tell me he is. But as President Reagan, he fails the test.
Why should a competent, decent, mainly successful two-term governor of California, a man acknowledged by the reporters who have covered him through the years to be bright and serious and devoted, dead honest. Why should that man still have the reputation among some millions of Americans as Neanderthal or even dangerous, a hip shooter, lightweight, actorish? In short, probably not up to the job of President of the United States.
Mike, I find the farther away you get from California, the more that image exists. Not as much as it did before the '76 campaign, as I think more people got to know me, hear me firsthand, and learn what we had done. What I think it evidences is a tendency today on the part of the media to image build. They establish an image, and then I once angered some of the press by referring to it as kind of an journalistic incest, that once someone is tagged with it. For example, this is far afield from what you've just said, but I am so tired of reading something that one reporter or journalist once said about me, and now it is automatically attached to me in most stories. Ronald Reagan, who never got the girl in the movies when he was in pictures. I always got the girl. But I think they go on and they never check, so this image builds.
But as the campaign progressed, more and more Americans began to look behind that image, and they began to focus instead on Reagan's powerful rhetoric of hope.
I can think of no greater reward for any president of the United States than that he kept his country at peace and the people of his country at work, that he helped to strengthen the family and preserve the freedoms of his people.
He was an optimist, and he thought his optimism was based on realism. Of course we can turn it around.
He was what he said he was. What you saw was what you got, and what you saw was really good and very American.
Most of us either don't know who we are or aren't happy with who we are. And Reagan knew and was happy. And that is what came across in the camera.
Is there an age at which you think a person is too old to be president?
Well, I don't know whether it comes with an age or not. There's a physical condition in which he could be too old, and I've described that as when his knees buckle and his belt won't.
You know, I never wore makeup when I was making pictures. At that time, I didn't need it, and now it won't do any good.
Reagan always seemed somehow real. Take, for example, his newspaper reading habits, as he explained to me in an interview near the end of his presidency. Your old friend A.C. Lyles told us you read the comics in the morning, and Spider-Man is your favorite. Then the sports pages, and then you get to the serious stuff. True?
No, it's really from the comics to the serious stuff without the sport pages in between. I haven't got time for those anymore.
By the time the Republican convention convened, Reagan had the nomination locked up.
The Republican convention that opens in Detroit Monday will be the second in recent times to be controlled unquestionably by the conservative wing of the party. Apart from the naming of the vice presidential candidate, there will be few surprises, a far cry from the conservatives' first convention in 1964.
When it came to picking a running mate, Reagan chose not a dyed-in-the-wool conservative like himself, but his most recent Republican rival, George Bush.
More than anything else, I want my candidacy to unify our country, to renew the American spirit and sense of purpose. I want to carry our message to every American, regardless of party affiliation, who is a member of this community of shared values.
Traditional conservative Republican businessmen and the religious right formed the base of Reagan's support in 1980. But as Election Day approached, polls showed that he was also winning independents, including a large block of disenchanted blue-collar workers called Reagan Democrats.
We are going to pursue economic policies that are going to put this country on a track where once again people can hold their heads up, have jobs, save, plan for the future, and know that the dollar next year is going to be worth as much as it was last year.
But Reagan's appeal, of course, went far beyond economics. He seemed to touch a chord that resonated deeply with many Americans, as he explained in an interview just before he left office.
I came here with the belief that this country, the people, were kind of hungering for I'll call it a spiritual revival. The whole thing of the 60s and the rioting and so forth and the disillusionment with Vietnam, it seemed that the people had kind of lost faith in the destiny of this country.
Reagan's victory in 1980 wasn't expected in the early part of the year, but as the problems of the year dragged on, the high inflation rate, the U.S. hostages in Iran, it seemed to be getting more and more likely.
And a debate in late October with Jimmy Carter clinched it.
This attitude is extremely dangerous and belligerent in its tone, although it's said with a quiet voice.
Governor Reagan? I know the president is supposed to be replying to me, but sometimes I have a hard time in connecting what he's saying with what I have said or what my positions are. Sometimes think it's like the witch doctor that gets mad when a good doctor comes along with a cure that'll work.
The debate allowed many Americans to see that Ronald Reagan could hold his own with the President of the United States. In other words, Reagan was, for the first time, perceived as presidential. After the debate, Reagan hammered away at the Carter administration's failure to end the hostage crisis in Iran, a failure that, in the end, would doom Carter's presidency.
I believe that this administration's foreign policy helped create the entire situation that made their kidnap possible. And I think the fact that they've been there that long is a humiliation and a disgrace to this country.
Jimmy Carter, in many ways, in the American public, did not understand the reality of what was going on in America. And Reagan captured that concern that Americans had about their president.
By election day, Reagan had turned a close election into a rout.
Good evening. American politics and government are certainly turning to the right. President-elect Ronald Reagan, in building his own landslide, swept Republicans with him into control of the Senate. Governor Reagan, from Walter Cronkite, congratulations too, sir. We'll look forward to seeing you at the White House in your new role as the 40th President of the United States.
Thank you very much, Walter.
From the star of bedtime probonzo to President of the United States, it was an ending right out of the movies. But for Ronald Reagan and the people who helped elect him, it was nothing less than the beginning of a new American revolution. That story when the 20th century returns. Almost from the moment of Ronald Reagan's inauguration as 40th President of the United States, a new sense of hope and optimism was almost palpable. And as it turned out, there was good reason for optimism that January 20th. For that inauguration day was one of the most dramatic in American history.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear that I will...
Good evening. 41 minutes after Ronald Reagan was sworn in as this country's 40th president, the American hostages in Iran began their flight to freedom.
The nation's television screens during that day were flooded with powerful images, the homecoming of the hostages, running as a counterpoint to the official ceremonies in Washington.
Beneath the Capitol dome, the president-elect sipped champagne and got right to fulfilling a campaign pledge.
An immediate freeze on the hiring of civilian employees in the executive branch.
And so the Reagan Revolution began.
The President of the United States.
January 21st, President Reagan's first full day of work.
I want you to know that I don't expect every morning to be greeted by the Marine Band.
Reagan's cabinet was a mix of trusted aides from California and seasoned Washington insiders. That morning, the president told them,
"We've got to get control of the budget."
And then he left them alone to figure out how to do it.
Just didn't love the arcana. He figured he'd hire people, they'd work around him, and they'd take care of that stuff.
Broad directional movements were his thing. He knew that the United States had to be stronger internationally, taxes had to come down, inflation had to be brought under control, government had to get smaller. Somehow or other you had to return more in the direction of traditional values.
In a message to Congress that February, Reagan called for cuts in social service programs, an increase in defense spending, and a 30% cut in income taxes.
The people are watching and waiting. They don't demand miracles. They do expect us to act. Let us act together. Thank you.
But the two top items on Reagan's agenda, the tax cut and the increase in defense spending, appeared stalled in the Democrat-controlled House of Representatives. And then in March, a shocking event.
Ronald Reagan, 40th President of the United States, today became the 8th Chief Executive Officer of this country to be the target of an assassin. Mr. Reagan suffered a wound in his left chest from a single .22 caliber bullet.
The bullet narrowly missed his heart, but the wounded president reacted as bravely as any hero of a Western movie. Looking up at his doctors before surgery, he joked, "I hope you're all Republicans." And when his worried wife Nancy arrived at his bedside, he grinned and said, "Honey, I forgot to duck."
It's horrible to talk about these things in such a calculating way, but he was not doing terrifically in the polls. And when he was shot, he's so likable in these circumstances, and it seems so courageous to be able to talk offhandedly about hoping the doctor was a Republican and so forth, that he went up about, 10, 12, 15 points. And from that stage, he was a much stronger president in terms of his command of the people than he was before he was shot.
Mr. Speaker, the President of the United States.
The introduction was familiar, but the moment was special.
Just 4 short weeks after he was shot, the president returned to address another joint session of Congress.
Seeming aware of the drama of his return, he reached the lectern in the well of the House and waited out the 2½ minute standing ovation, head cocked to one side, smiling broadly.
Reagan was there not just to show that he had recovered from his wounds, but to urge the Congress once again to pass his tax cut bill and his increase in defense spending.
The old and comfortable way is to shave a little here and add a little there. I think this great and historic Congress knows that way is no longer acceptable. Thank you.
Congress passed both the tax cut and defense spending bills before the year was out. It was, columnist David Broder wrote at year's end, one of the most remarkable demonstrations of presidential leadership in modern political history. Despite Reagan's success, he disappointed fellow conservatives by not pushing hard enough on most of the social issues on which he had campaigned, like outlawing abortion and restoring prayer in the public schools.
I think the conservatives felt that Reagan wasn't committed to the details of their hoped-for change, and he gave up too easily on a lot of them, and I think that was true. I think he was also correct in judging what the public wanted and what the public didn't want. So the real conservative cause for complaint is that Reagan was sensitive enough to public opinion to know basically when to stop with the rhetoric and not to give his troops everything they wanted.
My fellow Americans, it's been nearly 3 years.
In January of 1984, Ronald Reagan announced he would run for re-election. And that June, while the Democrats searched for an opponent who might stand a chance against him, Reagan went to France for the 40th anniversary of the Normandy invasion. It was an event tailor-made for a president running for re-election.
Everything worked, including the weather. It was an event made for Ronald Reagan.
We stand on a lonely, windswept point on the northern shore of France. The air is soft, but 40 years ago at this moment, the air was dense with smoke and the cries of men, and the air was filled with the crack of rifle fire and the roar of cannon.
Reagan's themes that day, patriotism, sacrifice, brotherhood, underlined why he had been elected 4 years earlier.
These are the boys of Pointe du Hoc. These are the men who took the cliffs. These are the champions who helped free a continent. And these are the heroes who helped end a war.
It was powerful stuff, and it was great theater, and it was the reason that television ate him up, because he was, he loved to move an audience.
Tell me, are you better off today than you were 4 years ago?
That question had worked against Jimmy Carter in 1980, and it would work again in his re-election campaign against Democratic challenger Walter Mondale.
If his program was a television show, it would be Let's Make a Deal. That is, you trade your prosperity for the surprise he's got hidden behind the curtain.
The biggest success story working for Ronald Reagan was in the economy. By 1984, there was a pretty sustained growth pattern underway, and presidents lucky enough to have that when they run for re-election usually get it.
America's best days lie ahead. And you know, you'll forgive me, I'm gonna do it just one more time. You ain't seen nothing yet.
Reagan got 59% of the popular vote, and he carried 49 of the 50 states. His second term was full of surprises, some pleasant, some unpleasant. For example, in contrast to the harsh, anti-Soviet rhetoric of his first term, Ronald Reagan made great strides toward improving relations with the Soviet Union's dynamic new General Secretary, Mikhail Gorbachev.
I told him this statement that has been made by others. We don't mistrust each other because we're armed. We're armed because we mistrust each other.
The first treaty of its kind since the dawn of the nuclear age is signed and sealed at the summit. Signed by President Reagan. Signed by Soviet General Secretary Gorbachev. A treaty to destroy some superpower nuclear missiles.
Then there were the unpleasant surprises.
Some political observers are now talking about a president in decline, a president suffering a serious loss of authority in the nation and in the world.
The problems that hurt Ronald Reagan towards the end of his presidency, I think, were as follows. The Republicans lost control of the Senate in 1986. There had been a wicked downturn that year in the farm states and the oil states. And you had the beginnings of the S&L crisis, and it was clear that the economy had not gone into super high gear the way some of his advisors had hoped. And then Iran-Contra came along and raised real doubts about his truthfulness.
For 11 weeks, the television cameras focused on the Iran-Contra hearings in Washington. Hearings to delve into shocking charges that the U.S. had sold weapons to Iran to help free the hostages in Lebanon, and that the proceeds from these sales had been funneled to right-wing rebels in Nicaragua who were fighting a left-wing government there. Among those accused of masterminding the scheme, Marine Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North.
I assumed that the president was aware of what I was doing and had, through my superiors, approved it.
I'm deeply troubled that the implementation of a policy aimed at resolving a truly tragic situation in the Middle East has resulted in such controversy.
How, people asked, how could Ronald Reagan have let it happen?
I take full responsibility for my own actions and for those of my administration. As angry as I may be about activities undertaken without my knowledge, I am still accountable for those activities.
President Reagan has had a very particular style of decision-making, which for about 6 years worked extremely well and better than any professor of political science would have predicted. But that loose control also made it possible for an essentially harebrained scheme to get through.
While Iran-Contra left perhaps the greatest stain on the Reagan presidency, it was not his only problem. When Ronald Reagan came into office pledging to balance the budget, the national debt was under $1 trillion. When he left office 8 years later, the national debt had more than doubled to $2.6 trillion. And in addition, his critics charged that Reagan truckled too often to Americans' baser instincts, that he paid too little heed to those left behind in America.
In the Washington Post, Juan Williams writes, 8 years of Ronald Reagan has left many blacks feeling scorned and neglected, and many whites feeling far less inclined and morally obliged to lend a helping hand to the black community. Can you understand why blacks may feel that they have missed the Reagan Revolution?
Well, I know that many have, but that's because by some of these leaders that you've mentioned, they're being told these things about me. Mike, as governor of California, I appointed more blacks to executive and policy-making positions in government than all the previous governors of California put together. I was raised in a household in which the greatest sin that would bring the wrath of both father and mother down on me and on my brother was prejudice and discrimination. And as a sports announcer, when blacks were denied the right to play Major League Baseball, I was one of the little group in the nation that editorialized constantly that that shouldn't be, that they should be allowed to participate in sports. I could cite incident after incident that this has been my history. And so one of the great things that I have suffered in this job is this feeling and this editorializing comment that somehow I'm on the other side.
In any case, despite all this, nothing negative ever seemed to stick to Ronald Reagan. He was the Teflon president, and few held anything against him for long.
Ronald Reagan is leaving office more popular than any departing president since public opinion polling began.
It's no secret who I believe should pick up the lease around here in January.
At the end of his second term, Ronald Reagan was attempting to pass his conservative torch and his enormous popularity to his loyal, steadfast vice president, George Bush.
Yes, this is the kind of man I want to follow me. Someone who will take over our battle forward, who will speak our gospel truly, and will do the work that is yet to be done.
I, George Herbert Walker Bush, do solemnly swear.
By the time he took that oath, George Herbert Walker Bush already had taken another, for him just as crucial, to follow through on the Reagan Revolution.
But the pledge that most endeared him to conservatives at the 1988 Republican Convention would come back to haunt him.
Read my lips. No new taxes.
It didn't matter that the Berlin Wall fell while George Bush was president, or that the Soviet Union collapsed, or that Bush forged an international coalition that drove Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. He had broken his word. He had raised taxes, just like a Democrat. And when the Democrats ran Arkansas Governor Bill Clinton against Bush in 1992, George Bush lost.
Bush was fired from the presidency because he had not governed as a conservative. His party punished him. His own people, some of them went for Perot, some of them actually went for Clinton as a protest vote, some of them stayed home. But he got fired, and it capped and underscored the lesson. The Republican Party is now the modern conservative party of the United States of America, and that's the way that is.
In 1993, Bill Clinton took over the White House. Democrats controlled both houses of Congress, and for a while it seemed that the Reagan Revolution was over. But something had been changing in the House of Representatives since the Reagan years. Aggressive conservative congressmen had been gradually gaining power and influence, and they were on the verge of revitalizing the Reagan Revolution. Their story, When the 20th Century Returns. When George Bush lost to Bill Clinton in 1992 after just one term as president, some people thought that history had closed the books on the Reagan Revolution. But it turned out that the true heirs of Reagan were not in the Bush White House, but in the Republican minority in the House of Representatives. They believed America was ready for a turn to the right. And ironically, George Bush's 1992 defeat gave them their chance.
The feds are too big. They're too strong. They're doing things they shouldn't be doing. It's not part of the Constitution.
Without a president in the White House, the rhetorical leadership of the Republican Party fell to the feisty House Minority Leader, Newton Leroy Gingrich.
Call and raise Cain. That's why we're there.
Newt Gingrich had gone to Washington in '79, 2 years before Ronald Reagan became president. He spent the Reagan and Bush years raising Cain with the Democratic majority in the House and talking up the conservative cause.
But we're grassroots conservatives. I think we're much more oriented towards the guy or gal who works for a living and is concerned about everyday grocery prices than maybe the more traditional vision of a conservative.
Newt Gingrich ignored the gentlemanly advice of older Republican leaders in the Congress and relentlessly attacked the ethics of Democratic Speaker of the House Jim Wright.
As the questions raised against the Speaker are serious, it is imperative that this cloud no longer hang over this great institution.
Gingrich demanded an ethics investigation into charges Wright illegally accepted gifts and schemed to avoid congressional limits on speaking fees. Wright quit rather than face the charges.
Bring this period of mindless cannibalism to an end. There's been enough of it.
Congressmen on both sides of the aisle were distressed by the vehemence of the attacks that led to the Speaker's downfall.
I hope his advice that we stop turning this place into Beirut and run this like a Congress will be adopted by all sides.
But it was not to be. Gingrich and his conservative followers reversed 25 years of Republican behavior in the House. Instead of going along with the Democratic majority to have a substantial impact on legislation, Gingrich urged total non-cooperation with the Democrats to underline what Gingrich believed were the real differences between the two parties and their approach to government.
Newt Gingrich brings some fire and brimstone to the Republican Party. He energizes the party.
I'm going to be happiest when there are two Republicans debating an issue on television and no room left for a Democrat.
Heading into the 1994 congressional midterm elections, hundreds of Republican hopefuls stormed up Capitol Hill to declare war on the Democrats.
Republicans call the coming elections their best chance in 40 years to take control of Congress, so 300 of their congressional candidates from around the country came to the Capitol steps to make a promise.
If you give us control and we don't do what we say, throw us out.
They waved flags, sang, and then 4 by 4 put it in writing, signing what they called a contract with America to cut taxes, strengthen defense, crack down on crime, and balance the budget once they become Congress's majority party.
Every item in our contract is supported by 60% or more of the American people. Some of the items are supported as much as 80% of the American people.
And on November 8th, 1994, the American people sent a powerful message to Washington.
The Republican Revolution of Election 94 shook Capitol Hill like an earthquake today. Its reverberations went into state houses and moved the whole political landscape sharply to the right.
For Democrats, it was a nightmare come true as dawn broke on a different Capitol, a Republican Capitol. So what will be different? For one thing, combative Republican Newt Gingrich becomes Speaker of the House and third in the presidential line of succession.
We intend to be revolutionaries in the sense that we are actually going to do after the election what we said we would do before the election.
It's the biggest Republican freshman class since the elections right after World War II. And for the first time in this century, freshman Republicans are being appointed to the powerful committees that deal with taxes and spending.
They are Reagan's heirs. They loved Reagan. They did not love Bush. They did not love a lot of presidents before Reagan, but they loved Reagan. And they mean to put forward a Reagan-esque agenda.
And then, ironically, on the eve of the historic 1994 midterm elections, the man who had started it all made a sad disclosure.
Former President Ronald Reagan notified news agencies late today that he has been diagnosed as having Alzheimer's disease.
The outpouring of sympathy at the news of Mr. Reagan's illness is proof, if any were needed, that he remains the most popular living ex-president, and he's a real presence in this election.
One of the really striking things about this election is the degree to which Ronald Reagan controls the soul of the Republican Party.
But near the end of the 20th century, it became clear that Ronald Reagan's vision controlled more than the soul of the Republican Party. Listen to Democrat Bill Clinton's 1996 State of the Union message.
We know big government does not have all the answers. We know there's not a program for every problem. We know and we have worked to give the American people a smaller, less bureaucratic government in Washington. And we have to give the American people one that lives within its means. The era of big government is over.
And President Clinton said, the era of big government is over. Whether he believed it or not, the rest of us knew it was true. And it's true because of Ronald Wilson Reagan and the job he has done.
We have very few leaders who come along who have this combination of a solid core of reasonable beliefs, a gentleness of their soul, and an ability to communicate optimism. I mean, what a combination. Every political party that's been able to say, I know where the future is, has won. The Democrats did it for 50 years. Reagan changed that because he said, no, I know where the shining city is, and I'll take you there. And we believed him.
Some final thoughts about Ronald Reagan's legacy when the 20th century returns. American humorist Will Rogers once said, "I never met a man I didn't like." Well, the same could be said of Ronald Reagan. Yes, he strongly criticized the 50-year growth in the size of the federal government, and yes, his criticisms had a major impact on the ongoing American debate about the proper role of government in people's lives. But unique among conservatives, Reagan ventured those criticisms with a generosity of spirit that made him irresistible to voters. As it turned out, Ronald Reagan was a hard act to follow. I'm Mike Wallace, and this is the 20th Century.